Hey nerdy knitters, welcome to another episode of the Nerdy Knitting Podcast. Grab your knitting and your favorite beverage and let's settle in and have a good chat. We'll start with a bit of knitting news. In the last episode, I talked about the Knitrino app and the lawsuit that they've joined against Apple, and we had some great comments left about that I wanted to share. But before I do, I just want to give you an overview of the content from last week. The Knitrino, it's an app that's on Apple and Google. They had a lot of hoops to jump through to get on Apple, much more than they had to do to get on Google. And a lot of it had to do with the different payment platforms that they could use because they sell things directly through the app, but you could also buy things from their website, which you can't buy through the app. So there was just lots of difficulties there. And it's created sort of a monopoly on apps. On Apple, you have to really work to their standards, which can be a good thing and a bad thing. And the good thing is some of the comments that were left about why some of those things are so strict. So I wanted to share those this week. Gary left a comment. He's really sorry for the app developers of the Apple app. However, this monopoly virtually almost guarantees that viruses don't appear very often on Apple devices. And if one were introduced, it could be identified and removed quickly and efficiently. Not a fan of monopolies, but I am even less a fan of viruses, Trojans, etc. Just my opinion. So that's a great addition to the conversation and another side of that coin of that monopoly on apps. And then Emily left a comment as well, and she said she thought the same as Gary. She didn't mind strict rules if that keeps my data safe, especially on apps that are used to purchase things and will have my data. Google loves data mining, so doesn't place the same value on privacy that Apple does. So those were both great contributions. Thank you for leaving those comments there. I'm going to put a link down to the Knitrino website so you can read more about this lawsuit that's going on with Apple in case you're interested in reading about that. The second piece of news is about a new podcast that I've discovered by Clara Parkes. If you're familiar with her in the knitting world, she's written some fabulous books about knitting and sheep, and she has a channel called The Wool Channel, or a website called The Wool Channel. It's a membership, but also some free content. You can read the different articles, and it also includes a podcast called the Voices in Wool podcast. It features conversations with people around the world whose lives touch and are touched by wool. So not necessarily just knitting, but just wool in general. Hosted by New York Times bestselling author Clara Parkes and made possible by the members of the Wool Channel. So if you're looking for a new podcast to listen to, I'll put a link down below for that podcast as well. That's it for our knitting news. So let's move on to answering your knitting questions. And we have just a few this week. The first one is from Emily. She left a comment on last week's video. This is such an informative episode. I never thought about twisting the yarn when working in the round, but it now explains why my yarn sometimes seems to unravel as I knit. I was also considering investing in some alpaca yarn, but now reconsidering as I get warm in sweaters as it is. Any suggestions for a breathable, cooler yarn to use? And yes, alpaca is very warm. That's why you'll often find it blended with wool or other fibers to reduce some of that excess warmth and still give you a nice cozy sweater. But if you're looking for cooler sweaters, then plant fibers are the way to go. Cotton, bamboo, linen, they're breathable, they're moisture wicking, they're nice and cool, perfect for summer garments or just lightweight spring or fall garments. And another positive factor for plant fibers is the fact that they're mostly machine washable, depending on the different yarn brands. You have to check the labels, but usually they're machine washable and sometimes even dryable. I still put them on the gentle cycle because they're hand knit, but they're easy to care for as well, which is another bonus. And wool can also be considered lightweight too. If you use like a fingering weight yarn to knit something, when you knit it more loosely, then it might be more breathable than something that's knit in a thicker yarn and a firmer gauge. And also the construction of the yarn. A regular plied yarn won't be as warm as something like a blown yarn, where it's like a nylon mesh tube and they blow the fibers into it. That generally holds, it's very light, but it holds on to the extra warmth, especially depending on the fibers. Like if it's alpaca, then it's going to be very, very warm, which can be it can be a plus, but it can be a minus if you want something that's not too warm. So if you're looking for lightweight garments that aren't too warm, plant fibers, or blends of plant fibers and wool. And the next question is from Natalie. Do you ever have a hard time deciding what yarn you want to use for your next project? I feel stuck. I guess it depends on if it's the yarn you're choosing first or the project you're choosing first. I generally choose my project first and then decide on my yarn. But I know a lot of people have a big stash, so they have a lot of yarn and they have to find a project suitable for their yarn. So if you're starting with the yarn first, then I like to go to Lovecrafts or Ravelry and then search for that particular yarn to see what other people have knit with it. And then also I will do a general search for patterns using that specific yarn weight and fiber content to get more ideas. And then I narrow down my choices depending on how much yarn I have. You know, if I have a sweater's quantity of yarn, then I would look at sweaters or garments. And if I just have a few skeins, then I'll look at different accessories or shawls. So if you're coming from yarn first, then that's usually what I do. I don't necessarily purchase the patterns on Ravelry, but I will get ideas from Ravelry, or I like to put my library, my books on there too, so I can search specifically through my own books to see if I have anything suitable, because it's not so great when your library starts to grow to have to sit and flip through every book to see if there's a suitable pattern. So it's good for that as well. Now, if you're coming from the project first, I would choose the project or go through the same Ravelry Lovecraft or my books or wherever you like to look for patterns, and then note the yarn that is used, the weight of the yarn, like the Craft Yarn Council, the medium, light fingering, whatever is on there. Make sure you know the weight of the yarn. Then generally I will go to Yarn Sub and get a good idea of like what's commercially available now that would be a suitable replacement. Then you can also do that yourself, looking at fiber content and the weight of the yarn. Those are the two biggies you want to. I try to match closely fiber content, or at least stick to the same. Like if it's cotton, I might knit it in linen or bamboo or something like that, but I try to stick to the same fiber family to make things easier, because usually the designer has taken that yarn into consideration when they've designed that project. But I also just generally purchase from just a handful of places. I like Knit Picks, I like Lovecrafts. They've got a lot of variety right on their one website, so I can choose a lot of different yarn brands and put them all in one shopping cart. But sometimes I want something special, so I do have a few hand-dyed yarn companies that I follow when I want something that's hand-dyed or really special or precious. But for the most part, Knit Picks and Lovecrafts are the two places I like to shop. I think that probably helps me narrow down my choices. I think that's one of the problems with today. There's just so many places to buy beautiful yarn that it can feel overwhelming. So I just try to limit my options, especially depending on what the garment is. If it's something for my daughter, she wants it easy care, then most likely I'll go to Knit Picks and look at their easy care machine washable yarns. But they've got such good variety just on those two websites, I don't feel the need to look any further, because I feel like that would be quite the rabbit hole you could tumble down looking for different yarns for your project. So Natalie, maybe it would be helpful to just stick to a few places that you really prefer to shop and look at those places first. Now that was it for our knitting questions this week, and if you have any advice or thoughts or opinions to share with Emily and Natalie about finding cooler yarns or choosing yarns for projects, please leave your tips and your comments. I'll share them in the next episode. And Emily and Natalie can go down and see those comments and see what everybody else has to say. Next, we're going to dive right into our topic for the week. We're still looking at animal fiber yarns. We're going to focus on two goat yarns, Cashmere and Mohair. And I'll have links to some articles for both of these down below that dive a little deeper into each of these types of yarns, how to care for them, block them, and a long list. Each one has a long list of yarns that you can look at if you're interested in either one of them. And of course, if you have comments or thoughts or opinions to share about these two topics, then please do as well. So we'll start with Cashmere, which comes from the Cashmere or Pashmina goat. Now they're not spelled the same. Cashmere yarn is C-A-S-H-M-E-R-E, but the goat is K-A-S-H-M-I-R, or the Pashmina goat. It's native to the Himalayas, and it has two coats, the coarser outer coat, which is called the beard, and the finer undercoat. Now both of these coats are combed from the goats once a year, and then the fibers are separated. Each goat produces just a few ounces of the undercoat each year, which is why this fiber is expensive. They're hand combed and then the fibers are separated, and just a few ounces of that precious cashmere. Colors range from a naturally light tan to shades of brown, and they are usually bleached before they're dyed. Now the hairs are very short, 1 to 3.5 inches long, and they're very fine. And this affects how those fibers can be spun. It has fewer scales than sheep's wool, which makes it feel more silky to the hand, but it's also much more difficult to spin, especially to spin into yarns that are going to wear well. I don't know if you've ever had a cashmere sweater and you might notice that it's starting to pill very quickly and easily. This is why, because they're very short fibers, very few scales, so they don't tend to stick together and spin easily like a sheep's wool does. So you can find 100% cashmere available yarns, but you're more likely to find it blended with other fibers to make it easier to spin and a little more hard wearing. So the advantages, very soft because it doesn't have those scales. It's very resilient. It's warmer than sheep's wool and it's very receptive to dye. But disadvantages, it's obviously expensive, prone to pilling, and it's weaker than sheep's wool. So I like to, if I use it, I usually use it with a blend. Or I guess if you're going to use 100% cashmere, I would stick to small accessories and things that are going to be treated very gently. Cowls, shawls, lightweight scarves, hats, and mittens. Now they will have a tendency to pill. That's why I like them on things like that, because probably even on mittens they would pill a lot. But a hat, you're not really rubbing against it. You get pilling when you have like the fabric rubbing against itself. Like you might get it in the underarm area where your arm rubs against the body of the sweater. You get that rubbing motion, then you start to get pilling. So you're not going to really get that on a hat. You might get that on mittens. Scarves and shawls, most likely not. Sweaters you would. So if you want the softness and lusciousness of cashmere for something like a sweater, then I would blend it with another fiber to help reduce that pilling and still get some of those soft loveliness of the cashmere. And then we have mohair. Now the fiber for this comes from the Angora goat, not the Angora rabbit. That's a different thing. That's where we get Angora fibers from the rabbit. From the Angora goat, we get mohair. Don't you love all these names? Now, it most likely originated in the Himalayas, traditionally raised in Turkey, but today South Africa is a very large producer with the United States, specifically Texas, in second place. Now, these goats are sheared twice a year, and they produce a single coat of fine wool. Now, the fleece sheared from older goats is coarse, and it's often used for upholstery. The fleece that's commonly used in knitting comes from the Angora kid, the young goats, and the fiber is known as kid mohair, which is the softest and finest grade of mohair. This also makes the mohair used for knitting an expensive fiber because it only comes from the young goats. Once they get older, we don't really use that yarn anymore. Now the mohair fibers are 4 to 12 inches long and they have fewer scales along the shaft than wool, which makes it very smooth. This also means it won't felt as easily as wool. So I'm guessing it might be the same for cashmere where they don't have as many scales either. Possibly that won't felt like wool either. I don't know. But this smoothness also means it needs to be tightly spun so it won't fall apart, the same as cashmere. Instead, you often find it spun as a brushed fiber with a halo or fuzziness. And you often see patterns that double this yarn with another. You hold them double to get that soft fuzzy halo on your project, and the other yarn provides the additional structure for the project. So the advantages are very lightweight. The cortex of the fibers contains air pockets and warm and insulating because of the cortex and those fibers with all the air pockets. It'll hold on to that warm air. Has very nice drape, hard wearing, it's receptive to dye, and it's generally easy care. Now the disadvantages is that it's less resilient than wool because of the missing scales, because those scales help wool stick together and give it that elasticity. It can feel prickly. I'm in the camp of the prickly. I know a lot of people love the feel of mohair. It's soft to them, but to me it feels a bit itchy. I don't know, maybe I haven't used really, I've never used really expensive mohair. Maybe that makes a difference. I don't know. It can shed, it's expensive, and it's definitely difficult to fix your knitting mistakes because of the fuzziness. It's hard to pull that yarn back out. So if you want to choose a pattern that uses mohair, I like to choose, if I'm going to use it, I like to choose it for projects that aren't going to be touching my skin because I don't find it particularly soft. But if you do, then have at it. Use it wherever you like. I also like to use projects with simple stitch patterns because something that's really intricate is going to be lost in all of that fuzziness. And if you're making mistakes, it's going to be hard to find them and fix them in all that fuzziness. So stick to something simple. And I would also use them if it's a project where I wanted additional warmth, like a hat or a scarf or something like that, because those air pockets will hold on to the warmth and hold that heat in close to your body. So that's it for this week's discussion on animal fibers, and we have a few more weeks of this topic. I think at least 3 more. There's a lot of animals that provide usable fibers that we can use to knit with. But if you have a topic you'd like to discuss after that, please leave me a comment. I'm not sure what we want to talk about next. Maybe blocking different fibers, or I don't know. So if you have an idea for something that we could discuss that's related to knitting, it could take a 1 week or a couple of weeks to really dive into that topic, then leave me a comment. Before I chat about what's on my knitting needles, I just want to share about our sponsor this week, which is Knit Picks. They are having a great sale on their Wool of the Andes yarn. That's one of my staple yarns. I use it quite a lot. You can get 15 to 25% off over 250 Wool of the Andes yarns. Now this sale runs through the end of Sunday, February 27th. So if you're watching this weekend, when this is first published, then you can hop right over to Knit Picks. I'll have a link for them down below, and you can purchase all of their wonderful Wool of the Andes yarns. So the first thing, not quite on my needles yet, is my daughter's cardigan. I'm knitting her a cardigan with a shawl collar and patch pockets. I'm using a base pattern from Amy Herzog's Ultimate Knitting Book, and then adding those details to it. And I'm using the Brava Sport weight yarn from Knit Picks. This is their acrylic yarn that's machine washable and dryable. I have swatched. I did not wash my swatch last week. First of all, I like to take my measurements before, my gauge measurements before I wash the swatch, and then I like to take them after. And because this cardigan is going to be going into the washing machine, that's how I want to treat my swatch, and I forgot to toss it in with my load of hand washables last week, because I don't really want to do a whole load of, I don't want to run a whole cycle for a swatch. So I meant to throw it in with my load of knitting that I do once a week whenever I've got enough to do. I have a wonderful hand wash cycle on my machine that's really gentle, doesn't agitate at all. Maybe like it turns the thing in the middle like twice, I think. So generally when I wash my hand knits, I do it that way, because then it has where it rinses and spins it out, so it's almost dry by the time. And when I do it by hand and roll out my sweater, like roll them in a towel to squeeze out the water, it still takes forever for them to dry. So I prefer to use that hand wash cycle on my washing machine. Even if it's an acrylic yarn and it's meant to go in the washer, because it's hand knit, I just want to treat it a little more gently. So anyway, no progress on this because I forgot to put this in the washing machine with that load last week. So hopefully I'll remember to do that this week. And I am making progress on my master sweater. I've added the sleeves. All I've gotten done so far is just the saddles. That took me a whole afternoon. See, the rest of the sleeve is just hanging right there. So that's the front and the back with the saddle attached. The light's acting funny. I'll try not to move too much. So that's how it looks when it's together. I'm holding the back. This is the front down here. So it's looking pretty good. This took me a while to do because of my own stupid mistake. First of all, my saddle was a little too short. I had laid them out on the table, and when you're laying them flat, they've been blocked and dried, and they've been sitting on a shelf for more than a week. So they're perfectly dry. So I laid them out, and the saddle was like an inch, maybe not quite an inch, too short. So I had to add a little more length to that. Now the issue I ran into with this was my pickup ratio. Once I finally had the saddle the length it needed to be, you're picking up stitches right here on the front and the back, but then you're picking up rows, or you're joining them to the rows, because this is going in this direction. So I had a ratio, a ratio of 5 stitches to 7 rows. So I was using that as I was picking them up. Every 5 stitches, I would make sure I would be working 7 rows to get that right. And I was still ending up with like a 1/2 inch of the saddle that was sort of hanging off the edge. And usually I would just, generally if I'm knitting a sweater, I will just go back like maybe another inch, and then I will just pick up a few extra. If it was the rows at the time, I would just pick up a few extra bars for the rows to even it out. It wouldn't be perfectly picked up, but you wouldn't really notice it. But this is my master sweater, and they are going to pick it apart. I mean, they're not going to pull my whole sweater apart, but they are going to look at every little detail. They spend a lot of time looking at all of your work and really seeing how you've done. And I knew that that wouldn't fly if my pickup ratio wasn't right and I was trying to cram in some few extra stitches at the end. They were going to see that and they were going to comment on that. And I really don't want to have to knit this sweater again. So I tried like 4 or 5 different times just seaming one part. Thankfully, wool is really resilient and I could just rip it out and keep redoing it. It didn't really show much. It might be a little bit fuzzier in that spot, but I don't think it's bad. So I finally pulled out a book I had on my shelf to help me figure out to help me sort out how to do the ratio, because I thought that I could pick up 7 stitches for every 7 rows for every 5 stitches. So I have a book, we're going to look at it later. That's this week's recommended resource. And I remember she had just a chart in the back about how to figure out that ratio. And using her math, I figured out it was 4 rows for every 3 stitches, not 5 and 7. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll give that a try. I've been trying all afternoon with my ratio. And so I did hers instead. So picking up 4 rows for every 3 stitches worked out perfectly. I think I was like 1 off on the end. Like it was almost exactly perfect. So finally, after a whole afternoon of trying to figure that out, I should have just checked that book first. So once I had gotten that sorted and I got the first saddle done, because this is seamed in 4 places. You've got to seam the saddle to the back of the sweater and to the front of the sweater, and then do the other shoulder. So once I had her ratio, took me maybe 2 episodes of 24. My husband and I have been binge watching that on the weekends. We're on season 3, I think. Sounds right. I don't know. They start to blur all together after a while. So there is progress made. The saddles are done. This weekend I'm hoping to finish, because the next step is, let's see if I can show it all on here. So there's the sleeve. That will be seamed to the front and the back. And then I can do the seam that goes like from the hem to the underarm and then the cuff to the underarm. That's just a simple mattress stitch, so that won't be hard to do at all. And I was concerned about, because sometimes you miss a stitch somewhere and then it doesn't quite line up perfectly by the time you get to the underarm if you've missed a few. But I have a stitch pattern along the side. I'm using a box stitch pattern. And so I think that will help me keep things lined up really well with a stitch pattern that's very easy to follow along the edge. So it's just like 2 rows of knit. It's basically like a rib. You do 2 rows of knit 2, purl 2, and then you reverse that on the next 2 rows. So you get little box stitches instead of a rib. So that should make seaming easier, hopefully. Next thing that I'm working away on is a design for Biscotte yarns, or Le Lame Biscotte. My French is terrible. Here in Canada, they are based in Montreal, Quebec. I'm using their Louise Robert or Louise Robert collection yarn, the Merino worsted. It's a superwash yarn, very, very soft. This is the color Oatmeal. So I'm designing a poncho for them. So it's just going to be one long rectangle, and then you seam the bind off edge to one side of where near the cast on edge is, leaving a big hole for your head. So it's just basically a giant rectangle. Well, not giant, but good sized. So it's coming along. It's getting quite long. So let me see, I've still got a few balls of yarn in there I've got to work to finish this with. But the pattern, super, super simple. It looks more complicated than it is. It's just a basic rib. How many stitches? 5x2, a 5-2 rib. But there is 1 row in this 4-row repeat where you add some yarn overs and decreases, and you get this little lacy design. So 1 row out of every 4, you're working this pattern, but it's a really simple stitch pattern. So I don't even have to refer to my notes. I just keep on knitting. So it's got like an I-cord edge, which I had to practice seaming that, because usually you don't want to slip stitches on the edges if you're going to be working a seam there. But the way this is worked, the seam, it actually works out pretty nicely, and it makes a really nice finished edge around the neckline and the collar, I guess, of the poncho. So when this side is bound off, it will be joined over here on one edge. It's hard to see, I guess, and you get this poncho shape. But it's sort of all squished up together right now because it is knits and purls, so it's a rib. So I will have to stretch it out and block it. And I really like it when it's stretched out. You can really see the design. So it'll be running this way across your body, basically. So this is, I mean, it's a lot of knitting, but it's really easy knitting, which I like when I'm watching TV and just relaxing. I don't have to look at a chart or my notes. I can just look at my knitting because it's only one row that I have to pay attention to every 4 rows. And it's very simple repeat. So I like that. I like projects that look slightly difficult. I don't know if this looks slightly difficult to you, but I mean, it looks a little more complicated, but it's actually really simple. But there's enough going on that you're not really super bored. I get bored when I'm just knitting garter stitch, and sometimes stockinette stitch too. That can get a little boring. There's enough interest here so I don't feel so bored. And the last thing on my needles is the Adventurer's Wrap and Scarf by Ambah O'Brien. I'm using Urth Yarns Merino Gradient set. It's a 4-skein set that's meant to be a gradient colorway. 200 grams, I think, of a superwash merino. Really nice yarn. Yarn was a Christmas gift from my husband. I made him a Christmas list from some local yarn shops here, and they had these sets of yarn. I had no idea what I would knit with it if I got it for Christmas. So it was kind of fun to have yarn that was in my stash. I don't really have a stash, so I had fun like scrolling through different websites looking for some ideas to use this yarn. Because I usually don't do that. I usually pick my project first and then find the yarn that I want to use. But it was a fun to have the yarn first and find a project. So I settled on an Ambah O'Brien pattern. And of course, I never stick to the pattern. I changed the stitch count slightly because she has 2 on there. The scarf, I had the right amount of yarn for. The wrap, I didn't have that much yarn for that. But both of them were very long, 85 inches, I think. And the scarf was the 10 inches in depth. So I wanted it a little deeper, not quite so long. So I changed my stitch count to make it, when it's blocked, when I'm blocking it out, it'll go to about 12 to 13 inches. And it's knit on the bias. Let me see. Oh, if you look on this side, you can see the central double decreases. They sort of fall off the edge. This one's going this way and they sort of fall off. I think it'll be more noticeable when it's blocked, but they're going diagonally. So you've got that bias shaping going on, and I mean, it's garter stitch with sections of lace, but there's no rest rows because of the shape, because you've got that chevron shape going on. There's stuff going on every row, so you have to pay attention. When I first started this, when I first cast on, I used the chart because I usually follow charts when I'm doing a pattern. And I kept messing it up. Within 6 rows, I think I had 4 mistakes. So I ripped it out and restarted, and I used the written instructions instead, which is surprising for me and so much easier. I just flew right through, and it's a 36 row repeat. So when I would sit down to start, I would just plan on sitting to finish one whole section, and it goes quickly. Like there's a lot going on, but it goes very quickly. So this is usually what I'm working on when I'm watching other podcasts and knitting things. You can really see the bias there, like that central double decrease is going right off the edge. So I started with the lightest blue and faded through like a speckled yarn into this darker blue. There's four different colors. Yes. So I finished with the dark blue. I finished with this speckly yarn in here. And then there's a second speckly yarn that has more of the lightest color in it. So that's where I'm working right now. And then this is all I have left to add later on. So I imagine I'll be finishing this fairly soon. And I really like, blue is probably one of my favorite colors to wear. I really like this color blue, is probably one of my favorites. I just like blue. So I think it's a bit stripy with the darkest blue, but because there's such a high contrast between that light blue and the dark blue. that I don't think it would be possible to be absolutely no stripy bits there, but I think it came out pretty nice. I like it. Guess that's what matters since I'm the one wearing it. Then I started fading back out the other way on this end. So that is coming along nicely, and probably have that finished, and then winter will be over and I won't be wearing it. But I did read something that winter was supposed to go into spring here in Canada. I did not like reading that because I'm getting tired of the cold and the wet, and it's been very icy here. We had some freezing rain, so our tree, we have a birch tree out front. It's beautiful to look at because it's just coated in ice, but it keeps whacking the window and I think somebody's knocking on the door. It's just the tree. But I'm looking forward to spring. So hopefully winter won't last too much longer, even though I will have to put my warm woolly things away. Now that's everything that's on my knitting needles. I don't have any acquisitions to share this week. No yarn purchases coming in the mail. I do have a few books on the way. I didn't purchase them, but I'm going to be writing some book reviews for Cast On magazine. That's the digital publication for the Knitting Guild Association. So I am waiting for those books. But this week's recommendation is Knitting Pattern Essentials by Sally Melville. This is not for the faint of heart. This is for those people who can never follow a pattern and want to change things, or they want to design something from scratch for themselves. I would put it in that category. This was the book I referred to when I could not figure out what was going on with my master sweater when I was trying to seam the saddle shoulders together. My pickup ratio was not working. I could have fudged it, and I would have if it was a personal sweater, but where it's for my master knitting course, I wanted it to be as perfect as I could get it. So, and I remembered that she had a chapter in the back, not even a chapter. She's got, well, like a lot of knitting books, it's got the charts for the hook and needle sizes in the back and the standard yarn weight system. And then she has 2 pages, and I have them marked. Like you can see each chapter I've got marked because I do use this book a lot. But then right in the back, the ratio page. So she's got these charts, one for the ratio for decreasing, and she has one for seaming. And I'm not a math person, so having somebody do this for me was so much easier. So she just tells you exactly how to do it. You have to know your gauge, your stitch gauge and your row gauge. And she shows you, this, you have to divide them. You go to the nearest result in her chart. And I had, what was it? Oh, I had 5 stitches for every 7 rows. So what you do is you divide 5 by 7. And that gave me 0.75, some other numbers, but basically 0.75, which gives me a ratio of seaming for 3 stitches for every 4 rows. So I was trying to do 5 and 7, but according to her book, 3 to 4 was a better ratio. And I did that, and my sweater was perfect. So it's really useful. I think I would have paid the full amount for this book just for this section right here. And then she has ratios for picking up and knitting if you have to pick up stitches. So really, really a great book. But that's just the ratio. I haven't told you about the rest. The rest is on basically how to design, or what she calls draft, a knitting pattern for yourself. Or if you want to design and sell patterns, then this will walk you through step by step. She's got the whole first chapter is just on preparing to draft. So everything you would need to know about that, like understanding the different lines, your stitches and rows, and looking at existing garments for ideas, which is very helpful. I don't know if you've ever been in the store and saw something that you liked and you took a picture of it, and then later you're like, I don't know how to recreate that. Well, she can help you figure it out. And then she's got a section on basic shapes. Oh, let me see if I can get this up there so you can see it. There. So these are the shapes that she walks through in the book. So you can pick your type of sleeve. There it goes. Your type of sleeve and your neckline and even your hemline. And it's a lot of math because this is drafting. You're drafting a pattern from scratch. You knit your swatch. You use that to calculate your stitches and rows, and that's the information you need to knit a sweater. So this is basic. This is specifically for garments. You're not going to find anything in here about accessories. It's all garments. So if you are in the market for designing for yourself, or if you like to change existing patterns to make them fit you better, because honestly, I think it doesn't really matter. Like, you can knit a sweater just following the instructions and it might fit pretty good. But if you want like a perfect fit, you're going to have to make alterations. It's just the nature of the game. It's like shopping in a store. You'll get things that fit, but it's very rare that you find something that fits absolutely perfectly. If you are, buy them all. Or if you do find something, then buy it in all the colors. But I think a lot of knitters expect everything to fit just perfectly when they knit something, and I've always had to make alterations. My arms are short, my torso is long, I have a larger bust, so I always have to accommodate those three things. And most likely you have things that you're going to have to accommodate as well. So I like this book for that, but it involves a lot of math. And if that sort of scares you off, then it's not a good book for you. If you're like me and you want something to help you modify your sweaters, then Knitting and Pattern Essentials is a really good book. The last thing on the agenda is the Fix Your Knitting Mistakes course. I just released 2 more modules, so I think we're up to the full 6. Next week I'll be releasing sort of the final exam. I'm not quite sure what to call it, where it will be a video on how to knit a lace swatch, but then drop down and fix a section of lace. Not really difficult lace. We're going to stick with simple lace, but with the 6 modules, we've moved from basic fixes like lifelines, dropping down to fix a stitch, to dropping down to fix a section of stitches in 4 different stitch patterns: garter stitch, stockinette stitch, knit 2, purl 2, rib, and seed stitch. Once you understand those basic ones, all the other ones are easy once you know once you understand the concept. So we practice all of those different techniques with one swatch. There's instructions for the swatch, and it has those 4 stitch patterns, and we use that to practice picking up stitches, dropping down and picking up stitches, picking up, laddering back up, all of those things. And then of course lifelines, tinking and frogging. And then after that, the modules that was just released this week. And the other module that was just released this week is about increases and decreases, because they're another thing that you have to figure out if you're dropping down to fix things. So a section just on reading them, the increases and decreases, understanding how they work. This is my giant swatch that I use to demonstrate different things. So I demonstrated the basics of increases and decreases and how they are worked so you can read them, because if you can't read them, you can't fix them. So we go over that, and then we move into tinking back different increases and decreases, and then dropping down to fix them. So say you had a make one right and it was supposed to be make one left, and personally I'd probably just leave it because who's going to see it later. But if you wanted to fix it, then I show you how to drop down and turn it into a make one right, or if you forgot to add one, how to drop down and add one. So all of that's covered in the module I just released. And once you understand all of that, fixing a lace section will be a breeze. So that will be next week's final exam. And then I also have to record a bonus section on edge stitches, how to drop down and fix your edge stitches, or if you missed one and you've got this loopy thing on the end, then how to fix those. And then probably another bonus section with more quick things, so you don't have to watch each of the full videos, because like the dropping down to fix the increases and decreases is about a 15-minute video. But perhaps you just want to know how to go add a missed yarn over, then I will do like a quick video just for that. So we'll have a bonus section with the short quick tips, I think. And then the full course will be ready to go, but there's still space. I never did reach I wanted to max it out at 60 people, but we haven't reached that threshold. So if you're still interested, there'll be a link down below and you can go check out the course for yourself. And that's all for this week. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the podcast. I love to share what I'm knitting, but I also love to answer your knitting questions and help you become a more confident, adventurous knitter. And if you're new here and you're looking for more episodes, I'll put a playlist right here so you can catch up and see what's happening for this whole past season. And I'll see you in the next video.